So once again, before you adapt the light cure material on top of your models, make sure that you have adequate separator applied to your models. I've actually applied a second layer, and you can see the model tends to look a little bit glossy. That gives me ample separation, so the light cure material does not stick to the model. So before I do that, I'm going to take a pencil so I can have a bit of an outline where to cut the tray back. And where we want to cut it back, we want to cut it at the deepest part of the vestibule. You can certainly outline it with a pencil, or you can just feel it with your knife as you're cutting through it. But maybe for the beginning, if you're not sure, you can outline it with a pencil. And we want to go to the deepest portion of the vestibule. But once again, we want to go up and around the frenal attachments. In retrospect, I could have outlined this prior to the separator because I anticipate this pencil line might stick to the back of the light cure tray, which I'll have to go back and clean it. So I'm creating a little more work for myself. So we want to make sure that we have ample relief around the frenums. And you want to cut this material as long as possible, but certainly not over to the land area here. We don't want to fill this whole space here with light cure material because it's going to wedge the tray on the cast and you might have trouble removing it without breaking anything. Okay, so we're going to go right to the deepest portion, right in here, as you'll see in a minute. Back here at the posterior border of the base, we're going to go right where we score the line. So I think it's pretty straightforward, and you'll see once I adapt the material, it's pretty evident where you need to cut it back. So I'm not going to make an outline there. So again, wear gloves, a little bit of Vaseline on your gloves, so when you're adapting the material doesn't stick to your gloves. So I just put a little bit on my fingertip there, and all I want to do is just put a little coat of Vaseline on my gloves. That's all. So we want to maintain the thickness of this material as we adapt it, with the exception of some areas, and I'll tell you which ones they are. Just like we did for our custom trays, we're going to start from the pallet, and we're going to adapt from the middle of the pallet over the crest of the ridge all the way inside the vestibule. Get it as much as you can in there with your fingers, and perhaps you can use an instrument to further adapt the material closer to the cast. So we have very accurate adaptation of the material up against the cast, therefore we should have increased stability inside the patient's mouth, which should make things a whole lot easier in the clinic. So I'm going to use the back of my number 7 spatula and basically I'm taking the material from the edge of the land area and I'm tucking it inside all the way down as to not thin out the material. So I'm going to do this all the way around. Now before you cut it back, this is the same base plate that we're going to utilize not only to establish the maxillomandibular relations, meaning the relation of the jaw to the maxilla, and establish certain measurements with our client at the next appointment, but we're also going to use this base plate to set up the teeth. It's going to carry down throughout our work. So to make things a little bit easier down the road, as we get to the setup stage, I know through experience, and you will find out soon, that most of the interference when you start setting up teeth will be to the facial of the crest of the ridge for the upper. So we have our crest of the ridge, anything facial to that, this is where I anticipate a lot of the interference with the teeth. So to compensate for that now, so I don't have to do it later on, I'm going to thin out this area. So I'm going to start at the tuberosity and all the way around, just facially to the crest of the ridge or outside of the crest of the ridge. I'm going to thin this out. So I'm thinning out the thickness of the material where I anticipate interference when setting up the teeth when we get to that. Of course, as you're squishing the material to thin it out, you have to imagine the material is being displaced one way or the other. So therefore, you have to go back and readapt in the immediate area as well as the palate. And what I'll do, just like we did with our custom trays, I'm just going to smear a little bit of the material in here just to make it a little bit smooth, almost mimic the finished denture so it doesn't feel rough in the patient's mouth. So I'm going to go back and readapt the facial side a little bit more. And then you can take a fresh blade and cut it straight down. All the way to the back here. So I'm just going to peel off this section just to show you what it looks like. If you have any leftover pieces here, you can go back and clean it up with another instrument. So it's all the way to the bottom of the vestibule. But very much short of the land area. This space in here will be filled up with wax. But before I continue, I want to have relief around the frenal attachments. So I'm going to open up that space. Try to be as accurate as you can now, so you don't have to go back and trim or excessively trim it. And you can see the green pencil that I outlined the frenums earlier is starting to show through. So I need to open that up completely and go back and round things off. You can certainly take your instrument and shape things further. I'll continue all the way around and I'll go back and do the other frenums in a bit. So the extension will be straight down. And once more, if you're using a sharpened blade or a new blade, it makes it a whole lot easier of cutting the material back without moving it around or displacing it. the very back, I'm just going to cut it straight across. I can see a hint of the vibrating line there. And as I did that, noticed when I peeled away the material, it lifted off the model. So you have to take care of going back and readapting everything, because if you don't, you're not going to have a good fit of the base plate up against the cast, and certainly you're going to decrease the stability in the patient's mouth, and it makes it a whole lot more difficult to do the bite registration. So you can almost polish that a little bit smoother, so it feels a little more comfortable for the patient when you're seeing them. And lastly, I'm going to relieve around this labial frenum. And also here I can see a hint of the little green line, so if you're not sure where they are, certainly when you outline them, it makes it a whole lot easier to know where you need to cut back. And I can go back with an instrument and open that up a little bit. Make sure everything is adapted well. Remove any excess material. And open up this little frenum a little bit more. Remember, we have to allow some room for wax to flow in there, and we're still going to cut away the wax as well. So we're going to create relief in the wax. So therefore, I'm creating a little more relief than I anticipate in the final product to make sure that we don't impinge on those frenal attachments. So just a final look-see here. Make sure everything is adapted well. It's very important that everything is touching the model to increase the stability of the base plate, and hopefully it'll make things a whole lot easier when we're working with our clients. So just like we did with our custom trays, we're going to insert this in the Like Your unit for about 2 minutes. Remove it. Place it back in the unit upside down for about 30 seconds to make sure we have thorough curing of the material on top as well as on the bottom.